Hare Krishna. So on behalf of Shri Radha Gopinath, thank you to all the devotees for joining. We'll start off by singing Jai Radha Madhava for the pleasure of their lordships. Jaya Radha Madhava, Jaya Kunda Bihari, Jaya Gopijana Vallabha, Jaya Girivaradhari, Jaya Girivaradhari, Jaya Yashodhanandana, Jaya Vrjanarandana, Jaya Yamuna Tiravanachari, Jaya Kunda Bihari, Jaya Radha Madhava, Jaya Kunda Bihari. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Ram Hare Hare. Jaya Radha Gopinath, Shri Radhe, Jaya Jagannatha, Jaya Jagannatha, Jaya Baladeva, Jaya Subhadrama, Jaya Nitya Gaura Hari, Jaya Nitya Gaura Hari, Jaya Nitya Gaura Hari, Jaya Nitya Gaura Hari, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Gurudeva, Jaya Gurudeva, Jaya Gurudeva, Jaya Gurudeva. जय श्री श्री राधा गोपीनाथ जी की जय, जगन्नाथ बलदेव सुभद्रा रानी की जय, जनित गौर प्रणंदे हरि बोल, श्री प्रभात की जय, समभक्त वृंद की जय। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय, ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय, ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं, देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत्। नष्टप्रायेषु भद्रेषु नित्यं भागवत सेवया, भगवतीरुत्तमा श्लोके भक्तिर्भवति नैष्टिके। कृष्णाय वासुदेवाय देवकी नन्दनाय च, नन्दगोपकुमाराय गोविन्दाय नमो नमः। Hare Krishna. So before we begin Canto 1, Chapter 9, we'll do Mangalacharan. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurumritam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Tadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yudapadakamam Shri Guru Namamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajeevam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakam He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namastute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrijavanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanja Kalpatarobhyascha Kripa Sindhu Vyaivacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So for today's class we'll be discussing from Srimad Bhagavatam Canto 1 Chapter 9 in story format. So for the previous 2 days we actually discussed about how Shri Krishna saved Parikshit Maharaj from the womb of Uttara Devi and Kunti Mayani. Yesterday she was praying to the Lord. And yesterday we left off when Maharaj Yudhishthira humbly requested the Lord to actually stay back a little bit longer because he thought that it was actually his fault, like this Mahabharata was his fault, that so many people would pass away in the battle. So the Lord, being so kind to his devotees, he actually stayed back, and the Lord actually had plans for the Pandavas, like we mentioned. So later, Maharaj Yudhishthira and his younger brothers, great sages like Srila Vyasadev, Tomya, which was the Pandava priest, also went to visit Bhishmadev, who at that time was lying on the bed of arrows at his own will, as he had Ichamaran, so he could pass away whenever he wanted to. So this was the time when actually Bhishmadev was about to pass away. So the Supreme Lord Sri Krishna, also who sat with Arjuna on Arjuna's chariot, he also accompanied everyone to go to Bhishmadev. And Sutta Goswami, so while explaining this scene where Maharaj Yudhishthira was surrounded by everyone, he compares it just like when Kuvera, the demigod of wealth, he comes around and he's followed by the Guhyakas, so they're basically like his attendants. So it's just like Kuvera in the middle and then Guhyakas on the side. So this was Lord Krishna's plan, that the Pandavas will have to go to visit their grandsire Bhishmadev at that time of passing, because one, Bhishmadev might be satisfied to see them all happy and when he was approaching his death, and two, also that Bhishmadev could give messages or instructions to Maharaj Yudhishthira, so how he can undertake his occupational duties as like the king of Hastinapur. And the third one was that the Lord knew that Bhishmadev was also going to offer his final prayers to him, the Supreme Lord, just before he leaves this mortal world. So when everyone just reaches that area, they saw that their grandsire was lying on the deathbed of arrows, so they paid their respectful obeisances and bowed down before Bhishmadev. So at that scene, not only the Pandavas and the Supreme Lord were present, but also, like we mentioned, great sages like Narad Muni, Tomya, Vyasadev, Vashishta Muni, Atri, Shukdev Goswami, Kashyap Muni, just to name a few. So they were all accompanied by their disciples, and they also Sri Krishna's Sudarshan Chakra was present there with everybody. And now everyone knew that Bhishmadev was not just like an ordinary person, like a Mandana. We know that the beginning of Bhishmadev's life, he sacrificed his own enjoyment for his father's enjoyment, and then again just for continuing the dynasty. So his history throughout Mahabharata is actually worthwhile discussing, as it has many key lessons that we can actually learn from. And so the rishis and also the Supreme Lord, they knew who Bhishmadev was and why he actually came to earth as well. So we'll just step back a bit, and just as a background to who Bhishmadev was, he was actually the son of Ganga and King Shantanu. So this goes more years back into the past. So it was like the history goes that Shantanu, the father of Bhishmadev, in his previous life was a great king known as Mahabhisha. So this king belonged to the Bharata dynasty. He ruled according to the truth and justice, and was actually, at the end of his life, he was rewarded with going to heavenly planets upon his death. So he was born in the heavens after that. So what happened was, he one day went to the heavenly planets and met King Indra there. So when he was meeting King Indra, Ganga had also come there at the same time. So Mahabhisha and Ganga actually had an attraction towards each other when they saw. And actually when the demigods, they understood that they had an attraction, then Ganga was actually cursed to come to this material world and take a human form and marry Shantanu when she came down here. So because she was cursed, she had to take birth in this mortal world, or Mrityuloka, and eventually Shantanu met her on the bank of the river as well. So again, they had an attraction, and eventually they were married. But while marrying Shantanu, what Ganga did was she put a condition. So the condition was that he should never ask her anything, what she's doing, like what activities she's doing and why she's doing that. And also, another condition that she put in for the same one was, if you don't follow this condition, the day that you ask me about why I'm doing such activities, I will leave you. Okay, so King Shantanu, he agreed to this condition because he actually liked Ganga and wanted to marry her. And then he said, okay, so I won't ask you anything and you can do whatever you like and I won't go against anything. So they actually enjoyed their life and they had 8 sons. But the thing was, every time they had a son was born, Ganga would actually take that son and put him into the river, so they drowned. The king actually did his best to stay calm and control himself up to 7 sons. So this king was actually a well-respected person because well-respected person in his kingdom, but he was very helpless at that time because every time his son was born, Ganga would just take them away and put them into the river so they died. Even though he had to keep quiet, it was very painful for him because he was a father and just the loss of his sons. But he was very happy and excited when the son was born, but as soon as the son disappeared, he became miserable. But even then, he just continued because he remembered the condition of not asking Ganga what she was doing or why she was doing that. And he knew that she would leave if he asked her. So this continued on for like 7 sons, and then the 8th son was Devavrat, so which we know as Bhishma Dev. Then this time came when Ganga started to go towards the river with the 8th son, and this time the king actually just couldn't handle or tolerate this. So he was angry and angrily said that, are you like a demon? What kind of a demon are you? And then because he was questioning her, why are you doing such things? Like, it's so cruel. Then she replied that these sons were actually the 8 Vasus who were cursed to be born one after another and die immediately, or having like a very short life. Then she mentioned why this son, the 8th son, wasn't supposed to pass away. So she said this 8th son had to survive because later on in life he had to lead a long life on this planet. So then, because Shantanu was a little bit confused, so she gave him a background, so she narrated this. So she mentioned that there was a rishi called Vashishta Muni, who was actually the chief of the Sapta Rishis, so the 7 great sages. And he was the preceptor of the Ishvahu clan, which is also referred to as the Surya dynasty. And he lived in a very beautiful area on Mount Meru, like all grass and flowers everywhere. He also possessed a cow, a divine cow called Nandini. And this cow was actually the offspring of King Indra's cow, Kamdenu, and was given as a gift to Vashishta by Indradev himself. So, like her mother, this cow was also capable of yielding anything desired by the seeker or like the owner. And so what she used to do was during the day, she used to just roam around the woods, like because there are forests like nearby. And this was actually close to the hermit of the rishi. So one day, the celestial Vasus, with their wives who lived in heaven, they came to this location near the hermitage of the Muni. And actually this was where Nandini, like we mentioned, roamed around. So one of the ladies, she held Nandini and she saw how nice it looked, and so she desired to possess it. So she wanted the cow and said to her husband Dyu that I wish to have this cow for my friend Jitavati. So she was the daughter of sage Ushinada, like a mortal. And so she was saying that her friend, by drinking this milk from the cow regularly, she would be free from all the diseases. But the Vasu, so Dyu, he knew that this cow belonged to this rishi, and that rishi would he tried to persuade her actually to just forget about the cow, because the rishi would not let anyone touch or take the cow under any circumstances. However, since the Vasu was unable to bear his wife just constantly nagging that she wanted the cow, then he ultimately just gave in and decided to carry the cow itself, just by force though, not nicely. Then his brothers actually just helped him on the side, so Dyu just took the cow away from the hermitage area of the rishi and to his home in the heavens. So later, Vashishta Muni, he was actually away at this time when the cow was taken away. So when he got back, he was surprised to see that his cow is not there, the cow hadn't returned, because it was like the afternoon time, and so it was like the past its usual time to come. And so he searched by the nearby forest, and he still couldn't find the cow. So what he did was he sat down on a place and meditated, because he had mystic powers that allowed him to see what happened in the past. So he saw that his cow was actually taken away, and then he saw that it was the Vasus that took it away. Then Vashishta Muni, becoming very angry, he cursed the Vasus, and he said that due to their arrogance, the Vasus, they have committed a sin, a great sin of stealing a Brahmana's property. May they be born on earth and suffer a mortal's fate. So later, when the Vasus, they came to know of this Rishi's curse, they were obviously repentant, and they were sad and obviously regretful for what they have done. They went to Vashishta Muni and begged him, like they said sorry to him, and to save them from the curse that he's put in. So obviously after some time, the sage gave in, and he mitigated the curse though. He said, my curse cannot actually be completely stayed. So it cannot be completely stayed. The 7 of you brothers who merely just obeyed your brother's orders, so because the 7 ones were just helping the main brother. But so you won't have to suffer the mortal's fate for a long period of time. It's only a short period that you have to suffer. However, you, who was actually the real culprit, the one who actually stole the cow, the one who did that sinful act, will have to suffer for a really, really long time. However, though, he said he shall be well respected, warrior, later in his achievements in his next life, and will not have any children though. So he curses Du's wife as well, the one who wanted the cow, to be reborn as Amba and later as Shikandi. So he also mentioned that his wife, as Shikandi, later will become the reason for Du's death in his next life. And so later King Mabhishak was cursed by Lord Brahma to be born as King Shantanu, and the father of Bhishmadev, and he became to know that Goddess Ganga was going to be his wife. So when the Vasus also knew that Ganga was also going to come to earth, they also begged her to be their mother when they incarnate on this mortal world, or this material world. So now we know how the 7 Vasus were cursed and actually had the short lives. But actually the 7 children drowned by Ganga when they were drowned when she was the wife of King Shantanu. However, the 8th child was the incarnation of Dyu, and he later became known as Bhishma or Bhishmadev, like we know. And after a long time for Bhishmadev, his life was full of sorrows, especially nearing the ending of his death, and he returned to heaven after his death at the battlefield of Kurukshetra. So, just going back to when Ganga was about to drown the last child, the 8th child, her husband, King Shantanu, asked her why she was doing all of this, and just like she explained everything to him. And she said, but since you have actually broken the condition that I placed, I have to go now. And then she said, this son, the 8th son, actually belongs to you, but since he's a baby, since he's really young at the moment, I will take the son with him, I will educate him to be a very nice king, and he will continue your dynasty. And she mentioned that as soon as the son becomes 16 years of age, by that time he will complete all of his education, which is required to become like the king, like a moralist king. And then I will hand the son over back to you. And this is how she promised, and she just vanished. So obviously King Shantanu was very morose and sad, but he couldn't do anything, because in this condition of moroseness and sadness, he passed 16 long years, and the king was very much pained, obviously, by the separation, as he did not want to lose Ganga, and she was out of his hands. So it is said that this is how in our own life, fate also plays a very important part. So King Shantanu again had to be alone for that many years, but he saw that his kingdom should not actually suffer because it was his fault, not the citizens, because the citizens were actually really nice to him. So just going forward a bit in time, so after the 16 years, again, he went for hunting of Ganga. And one day he saw that the flow of Ganga, because Ganga rushes really fast, like her flow of water is really fast. So it had been stopped, stopped by someone, and it's like a structure that was constructed like entirely out of arrows. So he saw a youth that was really like beautifully looking. And he was the one who was constructing the dam, actually stopping her flow by firing the arrows to it. And then the king asked the youth for his identity. He's just like, who are you? And at this moment, goddess Ganga, she came out from the river and she presented this youth to be the king's son, or their son. And she had named him Devrat. And she said that, as I promised you 16 years ago, I have brought your son now back to you. He has been taught all the arts that Shukracharya, the Asura Guru, knows, and learned all the scriptures from Brihaspati, the Guru of the Devtas. And he has learned the art of war and knowledge of the divine astras, or the missiles, from the great Parshuram. And he is in every way worthy of becoming your crown prince, or like the next in heir. So my duty, she said to the king, that my duty on earth are now over. Please take your son with you and just make him your successor. So after telling this, she again just vanished. So this is how Devavrat started living with Shantanu the king. And he was declared as the apparent heir of the kingdom, because he would be king next then. So later, as we see the sacrifice of Bhishma that Bhishmadev gave, so one day what happened was King Shantanu, he again went back to the bank of Ganga, and he was going to hunt there, obviously. And he came across a woman. Her name was Satyavati, so she was a fisherman's daughter. And just stepping back a bit, so the background of Satyavati. So one day, Parashar Muni, who was a great sage and famously known for reciting or being the speaker of the Vishnu Purana. So this Muni was walking in the forest, and he recognized that there was this powerful astrological formation that was going to be arriving soon. And because he spoke the Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra, which is actually the Vedic astrological text, so he knew that this astrological formation actually had the potential to bring into this world a greatly powerful person, and that person in the future would be the light to the world and would benefit the world greatly. And so he was just walking through the forest, and he came to the side of the banks of the river Yamuna. And there, Parashar Muni, he found a fisherman named Dusharaj, who was at that time ferrying people across the river on his boat. And so the Muni, he also just wanted to cross the river and go to the other side, just like normal people. But because the fisherman at that time was busy, he was handling many people, so he asked his young daughter to ferry this great sage across the river. And the daughter's name was actually Matsyagandha, because she was first the fisherman's daughter and had a fishy odor to herself. So the fisherman actually had found her within the belly of a fish that he had caught a long time ago. So he took the baby, because he was childless, and raised her as his own. She grew up to be a very beautiful and intelligent young woman. So Matsyagandha asked Parashar Muni to enter her boat so they can start going. So then she started rowing the boat from the shore, and they began to move across the river. And what happened was, in the midst of the river, Parashar Muni just presented her with a very unusual request. So he told her first who he is, and how there is this really rare astrological formation that's coming, and if she would like to come together. So Matsyagandha just said yes, as he was like a powerful sage, and she didn't want to get cursed or anything. So when they reached a small island, she expressed her concern, though, that she said that her body had like a fishy odor, and that apparently when she had this curse upon her when she was like really little from her childhood. So Parashar Muni immediately blessed her with the power that she would smell like musk. And it is said that this powerful fragrance was so strong that she afterwards was known as Yojana Gandha, so meaning that this musk, this beautiful fragrance, could be smelled 8 miles away. So the Muni also blessed her that she would remain eternally youthful, and her child also would be a great personality within the world, as the child would have all these good qualities and powers. Parashar Muni also said that later on in her life, she would become a prominent person in the name of Satyavati. So Satyavati meaning truthful, and a really great queen in the Mahabharata. So there, when the child was born, he was named Krishna Dvaipayana Ved Vyas, so Srila Vyasdev. And Vyas actually means in Sanskrit that someone who divides something, and this refers to actually Ved Vyas's primary task, so his main task why he came to this earth, was to divide up the Vedas and categorize them and spread them within the human society for us to understand. And so going back to when King Shantanu saw Satyavati, and when he smelt her fragrance, he also saw her climbing the boat on the bank of the river, he got attracted to her, and she told him that he has to go to her father to ask her hand in marriage. So Shantanu, who at that time was actually just blind due to the lack of control of his senses, he went and approached the fisherman. And the fisherman said that it is all right that you are a king, and I'm really fortunate that my daughter is getting such a nice husband. And he couldn't actually think of any more like a worthy groom for her than the king himself. But he mentioned that there was actually an issue that must be resolved before the marriage happens or before he agrees to their marriage. And the fisherman had one condition. He said that his daughter's children would become king only. He continued saying to Shantanu Maharaj that unless you can guarantee that the child born to you and Satyavati will be the heir to the kingdom, he will not allow for this marriage to happen. So of course the king was in confusion now, that because in his kingdom he had already declared Devavrat, his son, to be the heir apparent or the next king after him. So genuinely speaking, as a king and as a father as well, he couldn't agree to this condition because he was very fond of his son. He loved his son. He finally got his son after 16 long years. And the think of removing Devavrat from the next heir to the kingdom was actually hurting him as well. So because the kingdom belonged by the right of birth to his son Devavrat, then the king, he went back to the palace and actually he was quiet. He didn't speak to his son. So Devavrat, he was very smart and intelligent. So he saw these signs which he interpreted that something was actually troubling his father. Because his father was changed, it was like he was a completely different person. So Devavrat, he asked his father that what is troubling him, because he wasn't actually eating properly, or he was just always just looking lost. And no matter how many times Devavrat asked his father, the king just didn't respond to him. It's just like he didn't care. And so Devavrat, he questioned the charioteer of his father to understand what had happened and which places his father actually recently visited to, that so he could link it up and see why his father would be upset. Then Devavrat, he understood that his father was actually attracted to a female. He then asked his father again and again until his father finally just gave in and explained what happened. So Devavrat, he decided to talk to Satyavati's father. And when he went to the fisherman's father, Satyavati's father, the fisherman, he mentioned the condition again, and that his daughter's son would become the king only, not Devavrat. So Devavrat, he thought, and then he agreed to the condition and said, all right, I will not claim the throne, and your grandchildren can have the throne, that's fine. But when the fisherman heard this, he obviously was like happy and said to Devavrat that we know that when you make the promise, you will not go back on it. And that he had full confidence in the prince that he won't become the king then. But he was worried at another factor. So he questioned Devavrat that, I know you won't become the king or inherit the throne, but how about your children? Like, you're at a youthful age, like you're going to get married soon. What if your children in the future want to claim the kingdom? And then his grandchildren won't be at peace. So Devavrat, he thought for another long period of time, and finding out that there's no actually other option left. Then Devavrat, the prince of Hastinapur, he took a terrible oath, the Bhishma Pratigya, so which meant a lifelong celibacy where he won't marry anyone, nor will he have children. And he also said that he will serve all those kings that take the throne for however long he lives. And from this day onwards, Devavrata was known as Bhishma, so Bhishma Dev. After this, we know how Bhishma they remained very true to his word and committed to his pratigya, or vow. He never failed in it. So after this sacrifice, Satyavati then accompanied Bhishma Dev, and Bhishma Dev took her to the palace at Hastinapur and offered her to King Shantanu, his father, and his father was actually pleased. But then he later realized that Bhishma Dev took such sacrifice, and he was feeling pain that his dear son sacrificed so much for him just for his father's wishes. But unfortunately, time passes, you can't go back and change anything. It was too late. So because the king, the father, was pleased by his Bhishma Dev's generosity, the father actually granted him with the power of Ichchamaran. So which meant that Bhishma Dev could die at his own will anytime that he wants, but he was not immortal. Sorry. Then later, Shantanu had two sons, Vichitravirya and Chitrangad. So Chitrangad was actually a good fighter, and so he was occasionally invited to fight by the sides of the demigods. And so he was killed, unfortunately, in the battles as well. And also over time, King Shantanu also passed away. So only Vichitravirya was left. One day what happened was Satyavati, she called Bhishma Dev to her palace, to her room, and said to him that her son Vichitravirya and her are very indebted to him, because Bhishma Dev had always protected them from their enemies. And so she asked Bhishma Dev that since her son was at the marriageable age and she required help to find a suitable bride, or a female, and asked him for his opinion. So Bhishma Dev humbly replied to his stepmother and said that he made a vow to the will to protect her and his sons and to establish the right to rule over this kingdom of Kurus, and also for his father's happiness. And he also mentioned to her that she doesn't actually owe him anything. And just getting to the point of her discussion, then Bhishma Dev said, yes, that it is time for my brother to get married. And he mentioned to her that just recently he was hearing the news that King of Kashi, he was holding a Swayamvar gathering for all suitable suitors for his princesses or his daughters. So the Swayamvar is actually where the princess either chooses her husband out of her free will, or her hand is awarded to the king who fulfills the challenge laid forth before them. So Bhishma Dev explains to her that the king's daughters, they're all very intelligent and beautiful, and that they will make ideal wives for his brother. So Satyavati then kindly requests Bhishma Dev to go on the behalf of her son, and the king of Kashi had arranged the marriage competition. So when Bhishma Dev went there, he brought all the three daughters back, so Amba, Ambika and Ambalika, after having obviously the feast battle with the kings. But there was a problem. And it said, Amba, the eldest daughter of the king, said to Bhishma Dev that before you took us, I had already actually decided to marry King of Salva. And Bhishma Dev was thinking and asked her, why did you not tell me this before? I would have let you go with him then. And after thinking, Bhishma Dev said, now I'm allowing you to go so you can go marry King Salva that you wanted to marry. So she left. But when the king of Salva, when she reached, the king of Salva said, I won't accept you because you were won in the battle by Bhishma Dev, so now you're his technically. So obviously she was sad, and she came back to Bhishma Dev and told him all of this, what happened, and now that he has to marry her. Then Bhishma Dev told her that he has already taken the vow that he's not going to marry anyone, and that now he couldn't marry her as well. So Amba, she actually got really upset and sat for tapasya to Shiva. And eventually, over time, after her penance, so eventually Shiva, he gave her a benediction and said to her that you will be able to kill Bhishma Dev yourself in your next life, or your next birth. And this time you'll be born as a daughter, and later you will become a man, and you will be named as Shikandi. So during this period as well, Ambika and Ambalika were married to Vichitravirya. But unfortunately, over time, Vichitravirya, he suffered from a serious disease. And just like cancer, and then unfortunately he passed away at like a young age, and he also didn't have children at that time. So this was actually another problem, as there was no heir, like no another son to continue the Kuru dynasty. And then Satyavati, she was actually really stressed. She was like, this Kuru dynasty might go into extinction. So she requested Bhishma Dev that he should just help out in the condition he should marry and get a son, or like children. So Bhishma Dev, he didn't agree. He said, and he again reiterated the fact and reminded everyone, even the sages were with Satyavati's side. So he reminded them that he had taken a vow that he's not ever going to marry anyone, nor is he going to have children. So what happened was, later somehow Vyasadev, the son of Satyavati and Parashamuni, like we mentioned earlier, was invited to the palace. So he had come there to actually help his mother. And this is how actually the Kuru dynasty continued. Ambika, she gave birth to Dhritarashtra, who was born blind because she closed her eyes when she looked at Vyasadev's form. Second one, Ambalika, gave birth to King Pandu, who actually had a pale complexion because when she looked at Vyasadev's form, she turned pale. Again, Satyavati requested Ambalika to again get another son, but this time Ambalika was afraid because she didn't want to see Vyasadev's form again. So what she did was, she sent her maidservant, obviously with the covering over the face, to Vyasadev, and then the maidservant gave birth later to Vidura, who was actually an incarnation of Yamraj. But he was cursed by Mandavya Muni to be born on earth as Shudra, so that's another history. And Vyasadev told the maidservant that this child will be esteemed amongst the intelligent men on earth. So this is how the Kuru dynasty actually continued, and then Bhishma Dev looked after all the descendants. So going forward in time, one night during the Mahabharata battle, Duryodhan again approached Bhishma Dev and accused him of being partial towards the Pandavas. Then Bhishma Dev vowed to either he would kill Arjuna on the battlefield or make Krishna break his promise of not being involved in the war or picking up any weapons. So like we heard yesterday, that Krishna was not going to pick up any weapons in the war. So next day, there was like an intense battle between Bhishma Dev and Arjuna. Bhishma Dev was continuously just shooting arrows rapidly like one after another towards Arjuna, and he even tore Arjuna's armor. It broke his Gandiva string, so obviously Arjuna couldn't fire. And Arjuna just stood there watching helplessly because he couldn't do anything. And then he realized Bhishma Dev was practically just unstoppable. He was not stopping. And as Bhishma Dev was so close to killing Arjuna with his arrows, Lord Krishna, he just jumped out of the chariot. He lifted the wheel of another chariot that was beside him and ran just fiercely to Bhishma Dev. Arjuna, who was really scared at this scene, actually stopped the Lord. He held the Lord's feet and begged him, like, please Rishikesh, don't do this. Don't kill Bhishma Dev. And so Krishna obviously was convinced by his devotee and returned back to the chariot. And thus Bhishma Dev was successful in provoking Krishna to break his vow of not fighting in the war. So several days they actually passed and the situation still continued. It was that no one was actually winning. It was just like one day it was a tie, the next day it was still a tie. And the Pandavas, they went to Shri Krishna as they always do. And Krishna advised them to visit Bhishma and request him to suggest a way out of this war. But Krishna then realized that he actually had to intervene and do something for dharma to continue, for actually time just to fly, not just be stuck inside that just one war. And he gave Pandavas a hint as how they could actually defeat Bhishma Dev. He said that if a woman came in front of Bhishma Dev, he would lay down his weapons. So Bhishma Dev would lay down his weapons and would not fight any longer, as Bhishma Dev thought that it was not gentlemanly to attack or fight a woman. So just as a background to this, as to why Bhishma Dev said this, was that on the 9th day of the battle, Bhishma Dev took a vow that tomorrow either he himself will die or one Pandava will die. So Krishna, being the Supreme Lord, he knows everything. He knew that Bhishma Dev taken the vow. And so he told the Lord, called Draupadi, and he told her what had happened. And he said, look, Draupadi, you have to go to Bhishma Dev, and while he's doing puja, with your face covered, after he gets up, immediately just bow down to him. So Draupadi just followed as per Krishna's instructions, and she reached Bhishma Dev's room. She saw that Bhishma Dev was praying, so she covered her face, and as soon as he got up from praying, she immediately reached down to his feet and prayed. So paid obeisances in that way. So in our Hindu custom, it's like if someone bows down to you, you bless them. So Bhishma Dev also blessed her and said that, may your husband live long. Then she removed the covering, and Bhishma Dev was shocked. Like, he's just like, oh, it's Draupadi. And then Draupadi asked him the question that, now you've blessed me with this, but how is it going to be possible, because you've already taken a vow that you're going to kill one of the Pandavas? Then Bhishma Dev said that, so in the battle, if a woman walks in front of me, then I will leave everything and not fight. So later, Krishna told Arjuna to invoke Shikandi, like we mentioned earlier, who was a woman in the form of a man, and asked her to stand in front of Arjuna. So in front of Bhishma, so Arjuna can defeat Bhishma. We also see how Shiva's promise to Amba that she would be the cause of Bhishma's death, which was actually fulfilled, and Amba then got her revenge in the birth as Shikandi. So the Pandavas were initially they didn't want to take this approach because they thought it was immoral and they considered to be like cheating. But then after some time, they realized that there was actually no way of winning the battle with Bhishma Dev. So the next day on the battle, Shikandi came along with Arjuna on his chariot and challenged Bhishma Dev. So Bhishma then, being true to his words like he always is, he put down his weapons, and then Arjuna got that opportunity and just started firing so many arrows to Bhishma Dev. And when Bhishma Dev could no longer actually even stand, he fell down. And the arrows, there were so many arrows that pierced through Bhishma Dev's entire body, through his back, through his arms, legs. So his entire body was covered. And so the arrows, when he fell, actually made like a bed for him when he fell. And it is mentioned in Mahabharata that the arrows were actually so close that there wasn't even space for 2 fingers between each one arrow. So you can imagine how much pain he must be in. And Bhishma Dev, being like a great personality, he was in this helpless situation. The demigods from above, they showered blessings to this great warrior who had fallen. Later, Bhishma Dev, he requested Arjuna to arrange for a pillow so his head can actually just rest. And then Arjuna made a support like a pillow with the help of arrows. And even when Bhishma Dev asked for water, then Arjuna struck one more arrow to earth, and Mata Ganga, she appeared with her cold water, and then obviously Bhishma Dev drank the water. So we learn from this episode that fate cannot actually be changed, and fate is one of the important instruments of Krishna as well. And it is very powerful and very forceful. It cannot actually be altered. So an example is, example can be taken from Ramayana, the fate of Dashrath Maharaj. So as a background, one day when Dashrath Maharaj was young, so Prince Dashrath, he went hunting and he heard a sound in the bush. So he released his arrow and later realized that it was not an animal that he had struck. And he mistook this sound to be the sound of, it was Shravan Kumar, who at that time was actually filling a pot of water for his parents who were thirsty near the lake. And King Dashrath then finds that he actually had killed a human, not a game animal that he normally used to shoot. So he goes to Shravan Kumar's blind parents and gives them the pot of water. So however, being parents, they are able to identify that that's not their son. So they ask who that person was and what happened to their son. So Dashrath Maharaj explains who he is and then remorsefully explains what actually happened. So out of grief, because they heard the passing away of their son, they were really upset. So the parents of Shravan Kumar then cursed Dashrath Maharaj. They said, as we are dying without a son now, you will also die without your son one day. we know the effects of the curse, how Dasharatha Maharaja's second wife Kaikeyi, due to being actually manipulated by her servants Mantara, she asked for two boons from Maharaj. That one, Sri Ram takes to the forest, just lives in the forest for 14 years in exile, and the second one, to make her son the king, not Sri Ram. So King Dasharatha had actually to fulfill those two boons, because Kaikeyi, he made a promise to her that he will offer her something when she saved his life in the battlefield as well. So Sri Ram, being an ideal son, he accepted this and prepared to go for forest in exile. And after Sri Ram had gone, King Dasharatha was struck by grief, and he was really sad because he really loved Sri Ram, and he remembered the curse that he was given. And he tells the story to his wives and dies the same as well, without his son next to him, because this was the effects of the curse. So we can see that although he was the father of the Lord, like Lord Sri Ram, the Lord, who can basically do anything, could have actually increased the lifetime of his father and made him pass away when he came back to Ayodhya later, but he didn't, because Dasharatha Maharaja's fate was that he had to die in the absence of his son, because he had killed Shravan Kumar. And so just going back to the Pandavas, Lord Krishna, so when the Lord Krishna, Pandavas and the great sages, they were all surrounded by Bhishma Dev. Bhishma Dev initially talks about all the calamities and injustices that the Pandavas and his daughter-in-law Kunti Maharani had to go through. And so he mentions how it is because of the Supreme Lord Krishna that everyone was always protected and saved. And since Maharaj Yudhishthira was very sorry, Bhishma Dev consoled him and told him that this was not his or Yudhishthira Maharaj's fault. It was due to the laws of nature and time that things have to happen. We can't stop anything. And Srila Prabhupada, he also writes that everyone has to bear the actions and reactions of time, as long as one is within these conditions of this material world. Then Bhishma Dev mentions how no one can actually understand the plans of the Supreme Lord, not even Shiva or Brahma, the Creator, who can understand the Lord's pastime or what the Lord's plans are in the future. And Bhishma Dev also mentioned that we need to accept what happens as the plans of the Lord. So the Pandavas were advised by Bhishma Dev to accept their responsibility of the administration of the kingdom without any hesitation. Bhishma Dev then says to Pandavas that Krishna, that you take out of ignorance to just be your maternal cousin or your very dear friend or like a well-wisher, counselor or messenger, is actually that very supreme personality of Godhead. And so we know, just like an example as well, when it was the 8th day of war and majority of the Kauravas were dead, then Duryodhana got very upset and he went angrily to Bhishma Dev and said, "You are really partial, because all the Pandavas are still alive and majority of my brothers are dead." Then Bhishma Dev, he took a vow that tomorrow I will kill all the Pandavas with these 5 arrows that he had in his hand. And he spoke a mantra to the 5 arrows, making sure that they were going to kill the Pandavas. So Duryodhana, what he did was, he's just like, "Okay, Bhishma Dev, can you please give them to me? I'll keep them safeguarded with me." And so we know Krishna, being the Supreme Lord, he again knew what had happened, and he told Arjuna what also had happened and told him to go to Duryodhana and get the arrows. So before Arjuna actually left to go to Duryodhana, Shri Krishna, he reminded Arjuna what previously happened. So when the Pandavas were in exile, then Duryodhana came with his army just to show off their opulence in front of the Pandavas who were just living in exile in the forest. So at night, Duryodhana, he became drunk and he captured one Shabra girl. So then the Shabra tribe came to know of this, and they actually defeated the whole army and captured Duryodhana. So when the Pandavas were informed about this, that Duryodhana was captured by Duryodhana's general, Arjuna and Bhishma then came to rescue Duryodhana. So Duryodhana, because he's always puffed up and because he was saved by his cousins, he felt very humiliated and said, "Now that you have rescued me, you can ask for any boon and I will just give it to you. I won't say no." So then Arjuna, he was just like, okay, not right now, I won't ask you for anything, but when time comes, I will ask you. So then then Duryodhana was just like, okay, fine. And then as per Krishna's request, Arjuna then went to Duryodhana's place and narrated this whole story to Duryodhana and asked for those 5 arrows. So Duryodhana obviously had to give it to Arjuna because of his boon that he gave to Arjuna. So just that moment, that second, Duryodhana was thinking, he just realized that Krishna, he is actually the Supreme Lord. He knows everything. Otherwise, he wouldn't have sent Arjuna here. But then obviously he went back to being Duryodhana himself. Going back to Bhishma Dev, when he described Sri Krishna, that he is the first Narayana, the Supreme Enjoyer, but is moving amongst the descendants of King Vishnu, just like one of us, and is bewildering us by his self-created energy. So Bhishma Dev is actually one of the 12 Mahajanas who know the principles of transcendental knowledge. And so the 12 Mahajanas, they are as follows, as Lord Brahma, Narad Muni, Lord Shiva, the Kumaras, Kapil Muni, Manu, Prahlad, Janak, Bhishma, Bali, and Shukdev Goswami, and Yamraj as well. So Krishna as Paramatma is always sitting within our hearts, watching us and also guiding us. So although Krishna is equal to all because he's the Father, he's the Supreme Lord, he doesn't differentiate, but he's still more inclined to his devotee who is completely surrendered and knows that no one else is going to protect him, and that Krishna is the master and the only whole soul protector. So Bhishma Dev is thanking the Lord as he was fortunate enough to have the Lord directly in his presence before quitting this material body of his, and therefore he desired that the Lord stay in front of his view until he fully just passed away. He says, "May my Lord, who is four-handed and whose beautifully decorated lotus face, with eyes as red as the rising sun, who's smiling, kindly await me at that moment when I quit my material body." And also Lord Krishna, he says in Bhagavad Gita, "Yam yam vapi smaran bhavam tyajate ante kalevaram tam tam eveti konteya sada tad bhava bhavita." Krishna says that whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, O son of Kunti, that state he will attain without fail. And so after hearing these prayers that Bhishma Dev was glorifying the Lord, then Maharaj Yudhishthir inquired about the important principles of the religious duties because he was entering the royalty now. So Bhishma Dev continued explaining to him the caste systems like Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras, and their respective qualifications, and also what those caste systems should do and should not do. And Srila Prabhupada, he writes in the purport that Bhishma Dev advised us for all the humans of his 9 qualifications. 1 is not to become angry. Next, not to lie. 3rd, to equally distribute wealth. 4, to always forgive. 5 is to beget children only by one's legitimate wife. And 6 is to be always pure in mind and hygienic, in the body. 7 is not to be inimical towards anyone. 8th is to always be simple, live a very simple life. And last one is to support the servants or subordinates. And he mentions that one cannot actually be called a civilized person without acquiring the above mentioned qualities. So after instructing the Pandavas, headed by Maharaj Yudhishthir, then after praying and glorifying the Supreme Lord, Bhishma Dev, he laid on his deathbed of arrows, and for many days he waited for an auspicious day to pass away. So although he was severely injured, he held onto his life until Uttarayan. That came because he wanted to make use of that transition in nature to make his own transition possible as well. So it's said that there are 2 phases of the sun with respect to planet Earth. So there are Uttarayanam and Dakshinayana. And the sun's run is in relation to this planet Earth will shift from the southern run to the northern run, from Dakshinayan to Uttarayan. And that's why the terms of sadhana, the Dakshinayan is for purification and Uttarayan is for enlightenment, and also for the grace of enlightenment and of attainment of the ultimate. So then Bhishma Dev, the greatest of warriors and the grandsire, who fought against many battles throughout his lifetime and who vowed to protect and serve the descendants of the dynasty, and who was free from actually all material bondage at that time, he completely fixed his mind on the Supreme Lord and looked at the original personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna, who stood just right before him in the four-handed form, dressed in yellow garments that glistened and shined. Then he prayed to the Lord. Shri Bhishma Vacha Iti Mati Rupakalpita Ritrishana Bhagavati Sattvatam Pungave Vibhumne Swasukham Upagate Kvachid Viharatum Prakritim Upeyusiyat Bhava Pravaha. So Bhishma Dev said, let me now invest my thinking, feeling and willing, which were so long engaged in different subject and occupational duties, in that all-powerful Sri Krishna. He's always self-satisfied, but sometimes being the leader of the devotees, he enjoys transcendental pleasure by descending on this material world, although from him only the material world is created. So he continued glorifying the Lord and his beauty. So he remembered the scene when he was fighting Arjuna and when Arjuna was just about to die. He said he was talking about how Krishna looked, that Krishna ran out of the chariot and how the Lord's hair was just flowing here and there, and due to the battle, just like how the horses ran everywhere, the ground, the reddish soil, it loosened, and that dust was still in the air, and it actually wrapped around the beautiful locks of the Lord's hair and making them like really ashy color. And because the battle had gone for a very, very long time, and due to the Lord's labor, he was actually tired. So that's why the beads of soft, like the sweet sweat drops, surrounded his beautiful face. And Bhishma Dev also remembered that his arrows had actually wounded the Lord. And even though the Lord was hurt and his body was actually smeared with blood, he was still enjoying the pastime. So he was saying, this Lord fulfilled my promise that I made the day before, that I would either kill Arjuna or make Krishna break his vow. The Lord sacrificed his promise just to keep mine. And he came at me with the wheel of a chariot, just like a lion about to kill the elephant. And as the Lord was running to me with great speed, and he said that the outer garment of Krishna actually fell to the ground. So Bhishma Dev appreciated the all-merciful attitude of the Lord, because Krishna didn't leave Arjuna, his devotee, alone. He picked up the weapon to actually save his devotee as well. So Bhishma Dev also remembers how Duryodhana and his men performed such sinful acts later on, and then later on in the battlefield of Mahabharata, we see how by the grace of Lord, the cruel kings and the duration of life decreased because of their sinful acts and were killed. Also, when Arjuna, before the battle, he was really confused on fighting against his family members, and because of his ignorance, he didn't want to fight against them. So then the Lord, he himself explained the transcendental knowledge to him in Bhagavad Gita. And Bhishma Dev continues again to pray to the Lord that he was the charioteer of Arjuna. He carried the whip in his right hand, the rope in his left, and he always protected Arjuna throughout the whole battle. And that's why they were all still alive. And he wants to remember the Lord, who was actually the beloved of gopis of Vrindavan. And Srila Prabhupada writes in the purport that the Lord is satisfied more when his pure devotees are glorified, and therefore Bhishma Dev did not just glorify Arjuna, but he also remembered the gopis who had many opportunities to render loving service to the Supreme Lord. Bhishma Dev, he remembered when Maharaj Yudhishthir, he performed the Rajasuya Yagya. The Lord was worshipped by everyone there, including Maharaj Yudhishthir and the great sages. So in this way, Bhishma Dev was remembering the transcendental pastimes of the Lord as he was lying on his deathbed. And as we know, the Lord is non-different from his names and his activities. So it's all just him. And then while fully concentrating on the Supreme Personality of Godhead with all his 5 senses and mind, Bhishma Dev, then he merged himself within the Supersoul and his breathing stopped. Everyone around him became very silent as Bhishma Dev, the pure devotee of the Lord, he entered into the spiritual realm in one of the Vaikuntha planets. And after Bhishma Dev had departed, so the men on earth and demigods in heaven, they all sounded drums in honor and showered so many flowers. And after that, the family members of Bhishma Dev, they performed his final rites, the funeral rites. And Maharaj Yudhishthir, he was in grief because Bhishma Dev was not only his family member, but just like a friend as well, and like a philosopher to his whole family. And so after the final rites were performed, the sages and their disciples worshipped Sri Krishna, the Supreme Lord, and they took their leave as well. Then family members all headed back to the palace at Hastinapur, and Lord Krishna and Maharaj Yudhishthir, they consoled the family members, including their uncle and aunt, Dhritarashtra and Gandhari. Soon, Maharaj Yudhishthir was coronated to become the king of Hastinapur, and he strictly abided by the royal regulations that he had to follow as Dharmraj. And that was actually approved by his uncle and confirmed by Lord Sri Krishna. And so that's how Maharaj Yudhishthir, he continued his reign, serving his citizens, the citizens of Hastinapur, as per the instructions of Sri Krishna and also Bhishma Dev. So we understand that Bhishma Dev's life is very inspiring for us in cultivating our devotional service unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So it's worthwhile listening to his history as well. So thank you to everyone for joining once again, and please forgive me if I made any mistakes. Shri Shri Radha Gopinath ki Jai. Srimad Bhagavatam ki Jai. Srila Prabhupada ki Jai. Hare Krishna.